when former Navy SEAL Andrew Pendleton was thrown out into a deadly Idaho blizzard by his ruthless billionaire in-laws, he had nothing but the clothes on his back and his loyal combat dog, Odin. They were supposed to freeze to death that night in the unforgiving wilderness. But survival is what a SEAL does best. Seeking shelter from the lethal whiteout, Andrew stumbled upon something that simply shouldn't exist. A subterranean, moss-covered shelter, resembling a frozen hobbit hole. What he found inside wasn't just warmth. It was a blood-chilling secret, a decades-old mystery, and $195 million in untraceable cash that would turn his ultimate betrayal into the ultimate revenge. The sprawling estate of Jason and Margaret Whitman sat like a fortress of glass and steel against the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Coeur d'Alene Mountains in northern Idaho. Jason Whitman was a man who measured his worth in acquisitions both corporate and human. He had built a logistics and shipping empire across the Pacific Northwest. A ruthless tycoon who commanded obedience. To him, Andrew Pendleton was never a son-in-law. Andrew was an anomaly, a gritty, unpolished piece of charity that his daughter, Sarah, had picked up during a rebellious phase. Andrew wasn't bred in country clubs. He was forged in the dirt, sand, and blood of global conflict zones. A decorated Navy SEAL who had spent 12 years conducting clandestine operations across the Middle East and North Africa, Andrew had been medically discharged after a catastrophic IED blast shattered his left femur and ended his career. He walked with a slight, barely noticeable limp, a permanent souvenir of his service. By his side, at all times, was Odin. Odin was an 85-pound jet-black German shepherd, a fully trained military working dog who had saved Andrew's life on more than 3 occasions. Odin possessed an intellect that bordered on human, trained in explosive detection, tracking, and close-quarters combat. The bond between the man and the dog was absolute. They breathed the same air, understood the same silent commands, and carried the same unseen scars. When Andrew married Sarah Whitman 3 years prior, he believed she was his anchor to the civilian world. She was elegant, charismatic, and seemed to crave the grounded reality Andrew provided. But the gravity of the Whitman family wealth was a black hole that eventually swallowed everything. Sarah slowly morphed back into the cold, calculating heiress her parents had raised. It was the week before Christmas. A massive, historic Arctic front had descended upon Idaho, dropping temperatures to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The Whitmans had gathered at their remote mountain compound for the holidays. The tension in the house had been thick for days, but Andrew hadn't expected the sudden, brutal execution of his marriage. It happened in Jason Whitman's mahogany-lined study. Andrew had walked in to find Sarah sitting beside a man named Gregory Cole, a slick, ruthless vice president of her father's company. Sarah didn't even look remorseful. She looked inconvenienced. Jason Whitman stood by the roaring fireplace, swirling a glass of scotch. "We are done, Andrew," Sarah said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "I've filed the papers. My father's attorneys have already frozen the joint accounts. You're leaving." Andrew stood frozen, his hand resting on Odin's broad head. The German shepherd let out a low, rumbling growl, sensing the aggressive shift in the room's atmosphere. "Sarah, what is this?" Andrew asked, his voice low and steady despite the shock. Jason stepped forward. "She's marrying Gregory in the spring. You were a phase, Pendleton. A charity case. Now, you are a liability. I have an empire to protect, and you don't fit into the family portrait." Andrew's eyes darted between them. The betrayal was absolute, calculated, and devoid of basic human decency. "You're doing this now? During a state of emergency? The roads are closed. It's a whiteout. My security team will escort you to the edge of the property," Jason replied coldly. "From there, it's a 5-mile walk to the main highway. You're a survivalist, aren't you? You'll figure it out. Or you won't. I genuinely do not care." Before Andrew could react, the heavy oak doors opened. 3 of Jason's private security contractors, heavily armed men in tactical gear, stepped into the room. They weren't there to talk. They had their hands resting intimidatingly on their holstered weapons. "Leave your coat," Sarah said, sipping her wine. I bought it. Everything in the guest room stays. They stripped him of everything. His phone, his wallet, his heavy winter gear. They allowed him only his boots, a pair of jeans, a flannel shirt, and a thin canvas jacket. They didn't even let him grab Odin's insulated vest. The security team marched Andrew and Odin through the grand halls, out the massive front doors, and into the screaming, violently swirling abyss of the Idaho blizzard. The heavy iron gates of the Whitman estate slammed shut behind them with a definitive, metallic clang that was instantly swallowed by the howling wind. Andrew stood in the blinding whiteout, the temperature instantly biting into his exposed skin like thousands of tiny, freezing needles. He looked down at Odin. The shepherd looked up, his amber eyes blinking against the driving snow, waiting for a command. They had been discarded, left to die in an engineered execution by exposure. Andrew knelt in the snow, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck. Just you and me, buddy, Andrew whispered, his breath crystallizing instantly in the freezing air. Like always, the anatomy of freezing to death is a brutal, deceptive process. First comes the shivering, violent, uncontrollable spasms, as the body desperately burns energy to generate heat. Then comes the pain, a deep, burning ache in the extremities as blood vessels constrict, sacrificing the fingers and toes to keep the vital organs warm. Finally comes the apathy, the dangerous, seductive warmth of hypothermia, telling the brain it is time to lay down and sleep. Andrew knew this timeline intimately. As a SEAL, he had endured cold-weather survival training in Kodiak, Alaska. But this was different. He was underdressed, his body already running on an adrenaline deficit from the emotional shock of the betrayal. The wind chill pushed the temperature down to -35. The main highway was 5 miles away, but the snow was already waist-deep in drifts. Walking the road was a death sentence. The wind shear sweeping across the open asphalt would strip their body heat away in minutes. Into the tree line. Odin. Move, Andrew commanded. They veered off the road, plunging into the dense, ancient pine forest. The canopy of massive evergreens offered a slight reprieve from the razor-sharp wind, but the darkness under the trees was absolute. Andrew navigated by the faint, eerie glow of the snow reflecting the moonlight that struggled through the storm clouds. 2 hours passed. Andrew's hands were entirely numb, heavy blocks of ice at the end of his wrists. He stumbled over a buried root, falling hard into a snowbank. He tried to push himself up, but his arms trembled violently, refusing to support his weight. The insidious, creeping lethargy of severe hypothermia was beginning to take hold. He looked at Odin. The dog was limping, frost building up on his black snout and whiskers. If they didn't find shelter in the next 20 minutes, neither of them would see the sunrise. Suddenly, Odin stopped. The dog's ears swiveled, locking forward. He raised his snout, sniffing the violent air, then dropped his nose to the ground. He let out a sharp, urgent bark and bolted forward, plowing through the deep snow. Odin! Wait! Andrew croaked, forcing himself to his feet and stumbling after the dog. Odin stopped at the base of a massive, rocky hillside that was entirely entombed in snow. To the untrained eye, it was just a geographical mound, but Odin began to dig frantically, his heavy paws throwing snow in wide arcs. Andrew reached the dog, collapsing beside him. What is it, boy? A cave? Andrew began to clear the snow with his numb hands. As he brushed away the powder, his fingers scraped against something unnatural. It wasn't rock. It was treated timber. Metal. Adrenaline surged through Andrew's freezing veins, momentarily pushing back the cold. He dug faster, beneath 2 feet of snow and thick, frozen layers of moss and earth. They uncovered a perfectly round, heavy wooden door framed in rusted steel. It looked exactly like a door from a fantasy novel, a hobbit hole, but constructed with brutal, militaristic practicality. The shelter was built directly into the side of the hill, completely camouflaged from aerial view and ground observation. It was a subterranean bunker. There was a heavy iron latch and a modern, high-grade Medico deadbolt. Someone had spent a fortune keeping this place hidden and secure. But Andrew noticed the wood around the deadbolt frame was slightly rotted and warped from years of moisture. Desperation breeds superhuman strength. Andrew looked around and found a jagged, heavy piece of granite jutting from the snow. He picked it up, feeling nothing in his frozen hands, and began to smash it against the iron latch assembly. Once, twice, 10 times. His muscles screamed, but the image of Jason Whitman's smug face fueled a dark, burning rage inside him. With a final, agonizing swing, the rusted screws gave way, and the lock mechanism shattered. Andrew kicked the round door. It groaned, the frozen hinges protesting loudly, before swinging inward with a heavy thud. A rush of stale, dry air hit them. It was cold inside, but critically, it was completely dead to the wind. Andrew collapsed over the threshold, pulling Odin inside with him. He kicked the heavy door shut behind them, plunging them into absolute pitch-black darkness. They lay on the hard floor for what felt like hours, just breathing, letting the absence of the wind slowly allow their core temperatures to stabilize. Andrew's SEAL training took over. He blindly felt his way along the wall near the entrance. His fingers brushed against a small shelf. A box of matches. A heavy metal flashlight. He struck a match, the sudden flare of yellow light illuminating his savior. It was a marvel of covert engineering. The space was roughly 600 square feet, carved into the bedrock and reinforced with thick timber and steel beams. It was built for long-term, off-grid survival. Dust coated every surface, indicating it hadn't been visited in years. In the corner sat an old cast-iron wood stove, prepped with kindling and logs. Shelves lined the walls, packed with MREs, military-grade water purifiers, and old radios. Andrew lit the wood stove. Within 20 minutes, a beautiful, life-saving heat began to radiate through the subterranean cabin. Odin curled up by the iron stove, letting out a long, shuddering sigh as the ice melted from his fur. Andrew stripped off his wet outer layers and wrapped himself in a thick wool blanket he found in a sealed chest. They were alive. They had beaten the Whitman's death sentence. But as the firelight flickered across the walls of the bunker, Andrew realized that finding this place was a statistical impossibility. This wasn't a hunter's cabin. The level of secrecy, the reinforced structure, the location, this was a hiding place. And people only build hiding places like this when they have something incredible to hide. By morning, the blizzard outside was still raging. But inside the earthen bunker, it was sweltering. Andrew had spent the early hours doing a tactical sweep of their new sanctuary. The cabin was a bizarre juxtaposition of rustic aesthetics and high-tech paranoia. The walls were lined with cedar, giving it a cozy, cabin-like feel. But the ventilation system was military-grade, complete with air scrubbers and a manual crank generator. Andrew found a stash of clothing in a sealed plastic bin, high-end, heavy-duty winter gear that happened to fit him perfectly. He fed Odin a few cans of preserved meat from the pantry. The dog ate ravenously, his energy fully restored. "All right, Odin," Andrew said, sipping water from a melted snow pot. "Let's figure out whose house we broke into." He began a more systematic search. He found a ham radio setup from the late 90s, a few maps of the Canadian border crossings, and a collection of passports in a lockbox he pried open with a rusted screwdriver. The passports were all under different names, but they all featured the same face. A sharp-featured man with wire-rimmed glasses. Andrew recognized the face. Every news station in America had broadcasted it relentlessly 8 years ago. Thomas Scott. Scott was a prodigy hedge fund manager out of Seattle who had orchestrated one of the largest, most audacious corporate embezzlements in modern history. He had systematically siphoned nearly $200 million from his ultra-wealthy clients, converted the digital assets into untraceable bearer bonds, rare precious metals, and cash, and vanished without a trace. The FBI, the SEC, and countless private investigators hired by angry billionaires had hunted him. The prevailing theory was that Scott had fled to a non-extradition country in South America, but Scott hadn't gone south. He had gone into the wild. Andrew looked around the dusty, silent cabin. If Scott was here, where was he now? And more importantly, where was the money? Suddenly, Odin stood up. The fur along his spine bristled. He wasn't looking at the heavy wooden door leading outside. He was staring intently at the back wall of the cabin, specifically at a built-in bookshelf that looked entirely flush with the timber siding. Odin walked over to it, sniffed deeply along the bottom edge, and then sat down, looking back at Andrew. It was his final alert stance. The stance he used when he found hidden IEDs or contraband in Afghanistan. "Good boy," Andrew whispered, his heart accelerating. He approached the bookshelf. He ran his fingers along the seams of the wood. It was immaculate craftsmanship, but Andrew noticed faint, semicircular scratch marks on the floorboards just beneath the shelf, the telltale sign of a hidden hinge dragging under immense weight. Andrew searched the sides, pressing against the wooden knots, until he heard a mechanical click. The entire bookshelf shifted forward by a fraction of an inch. Andrew grabbed the edges and pulled. The heavy, concealed steel door swung open, revealing a secondary chamber carved directly into the bedrock. The air inside was cool, dry, and smelled distinctly of synthetic polymer and old paper. Andrew grabbed the heavy metal flashlight and stepped inside. The hidden room was essentially a vault. Stacked meticulously against the far wall were 8 massive waterproof Pelican cases. Next to them sat a heavy steel workbench covered in ledger books, a money counter, and a loaded, pristine Colt 1911 pistol. Andrew walked slowly to the first Pelican case. He popped the heavy latches. The hiss of the vacuum seal breaking echoed loudly in the small room. He lifted the lid. Two. Andrew's breath caught in his throat. Inside, packed so tightly there wasn't a millimeter of wasted space, were rows upon rows of $100 bills, Federal Reserve notes, wrapped in bank bands. He opened the next case, bearer bonds. The next case, gold bullion, stamped and serialized. Andrew did the math in his head based on the ledgers sitting on the desk. He was looking at Thomas Scott's entire stolen empire. $195 million. Andrew sat down hard on the cold stone floor, running a hand through his hair. The sheer magnitude of the discovery was paralyzing. Yesterday, he was a discarded, broken man left to die in the snow by a family of arrogant billionaires. Today, he was sitting on a fortune that could buy and sell the Whitman family 10 times over. Why had Scott abandoned it? Andrew picked up the final ledger on the desk. The last entry was dated February 14th, 2018. It read, "They found me. I don't know how. I have to leave the stash and cross the border on foot tonight. If I survive, I'll come back." Scott never came back. He likely died in the wilderness trying to cross into Canada. Just another secret swallowed by the unforgiving mountains. Andrew looked at the mountain of wealth. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was power. This was the ultimate key to dismantling the people who had tried to erase him. He reached out and grabbed a stack of hundreds, feeling the crisp paper in his hands. He looked at Odin, who was watching him with intelligent, unblinking eyes. "We aren't just going to survive, buddy," Andrew said, his voice hardening into cold steel. "We're going to war." But before Andrew could formulate his plan, a sound shattered the silence of the cabin. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Heavy footsteps in the snow, directly above the ceiling of the bunker. Andrew instantly dropped the money, his SEAL instincts taking over. He grabbed the loaded Colt 1911 from the desk and smoothly racked the slide. He signaled to Odin with a sharp, silent hand gesture. The massive dog instantly went into stealth mode, crouching low to the ground, teeth bared in a silent snarl. Someone was out there, and they had just stopped directly outside the camouflaged front door. The heavy, rhythmic crunch of snow outside the bunker's camouflaged entrance sent a jolt of ice-cold adrenaline through Andrew's veins. In the claustrophobic confines of the subterranean vault, the sound was magnified, echoing like a ticking bomb. Andrew stood perfectly still. The loaded Colt 1911 gripped firmly in his right hand. His thumb rested on the safety, ready to disengage it in a fraction of a second. Beside him, Odin was a statue carved from midnight. The German shepherd's muscles were coiled tight, his amber eyes fixed on the heavy wooden door. A low, barely audible vibration hummed in the dog's throat, not a growl, but the focused anticipation of violence. Andrew's mind raced through the tactical possibilities. It couldn't be Jason Whitman's security team. They had left him for dead 5 miles away. They wouldn't be tracking him through a lethal whiteout. And it couldn't be Thomas Scott. The man had fled 8 years ago. And survival in these mountains without his gear was impossible. Whoever was outside had found this bunker through deliberate, calculated effort. The crunching stopped. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was nothing but the muffled howl of the blizzard above. Then, the rusted iron handle of the exterior door groaned. Whoever it was had found the splintered remnants of the Medico deadbolt Andrew had smashed earlier. A heavy, gloved hand pushed against the thick timber. The door protested, frozen on its hinges, before slowly groaning inward. A swirl of blinding white snow and freezing wind instantly invaded the dark entryway of the cabin. Andrew flattened his back against the cedar-lined wall just beside the entrance. He signaled Odin with 2 sharp taps against his own thigh, the SEAL command to hold and prepare to strike. A figure stepped into the threshold. He was a mountain of a man, clad in advanced, white camouflage tactical winter gear. A thermal balaclava obscured his face, and strapped across his chest was a suppressed Heckler & Koch HK 416 assault rifle. This wasn't a lost hiker. This was a professional operator. The intruder moved with practiced lethality. He swept the barrel of his rifle across the dark room, a green laser sight cutting through the dusty air. He reached up, pulling a pair of thermal, quad-tube night vision goggles down over his eyes. Andrew knew he had less than a second before the thermals picked up his heat signature against the cold wall. "Odin, execute!" Andrew roared, dropping his voice an octave to cut through the wind. Odin launched himself off the floorboards like an 85-pound torpedo. The dog crossed the room in a blur of black fur and fangs, striking the intruder squarely in the center of his chest. The sheer kinetic force of the impact drove the massive man backward. The HK 416 discharged, a suppressed thwip-thwip-thwip echoing in the cabin as 3 rounds buried themselves harmlessly into the ceiling timbers. The intruder crashed to the floor with Odin on top of him. The dog's jaws bypassed the thick winter coat and clamped down viciously on the man's tactical vest, shaking violently to disorient him. The operator was skilled. Instead of panicking, he dropped his rifle and reached for a fixed-blade combat knife strapped to his thigh. Andrew moved. Ignoring the burning ache in his shattered left femur, he lunged across the room. He brought the heavy steel frame of the Colt 1911 down in a brutal, sweeping arc, striking the intruder's wrist just as the knife cleared its sheath. Bone cracked. The man let out a muffled grunt of pain, his fingers splaying open as the knife clattered to the floor. Before the man could recover, Andrew drove his knee directly into the operator's sternum, pinning him under his weight. He pressed the muzzle of the 1911 firmly into the soft indentation just beneath the man's jawline. "Odin, stand down." "Guard," Andrew commanded. The German shepherd instantly released his grip, backing up a single step but remaining positioned over the man's throat, teeth bared, ready to end it if the man twitched. Andrew reached down with his free hand and ripped the night vision goggles and balaclava from the intruder's head. The face staring back at him was rugged, scarred, and surprisingly calm. He had pale gray eyes that calculated the room in a split second. "You're not Thomas Scott," the man said. His voice was gravelly, showing no fear of the gun pressed to his neck. "Scott is 5'9" and built like a pencil pusher. "And you're trespassing," Andrew replied, his tone like chipped ice. "Hands behind your head. Clasp your fingers." "Now," the man complied slowly. Andrew patted him down, removing a backup Glock 19 from an ankle holster and a satellite comms unit from his chest rig. Andrew stepped back, keeping the weapon trained on center mass. "Sit up." Slowly. "Who are you? And how did you find this place?" The man grunted, shifting his weight to sit against the wall. He glanced at Odin, clearly respecting the animal's lethal potential. "Names? Silas Croft, private recovery agent. I work for an intelligence firm out of DC called Blackwood Consulting. We specialize in asset retrieval for high-net-worth clients." "You mean bounty hunting for billionaires," Andrew corrected. "Semantics," Silas smirked slightly. "I've been hunting the Scott ghost for 3 years. followed a paper trail of old property deeds and dummy corporations to this mountain. But the snow was too deep. I wouldn't have found the bunker if you hadn't fired up the wood stove. My drone picked up the thermal plume escaping through the camouflaged exhaust vent. Andrew cursed internally. The very fire that had saved his and Odin's lives had acted as a beacon. "So you came for the money," Andrew said. "I came for the $195 million my client lost," Silas said, rubbing his injured wrist. "But looking at you, you're wearing civilian surplus gear. You've got a military working dog. And you move like Tier 1. You just stumbled into this, didn't you? Some poor bastard trying to survive a blizzard and you hit the motherlode." Andrew didn't confirm or deny it. "Who is your client?" Silas shook his head. "Client confidentiality. Even with a gun to my head, I don't give up the hands that feed me. That's bad for business." Andrew stepped closer, the tactical gears in his mind grinding. "Scott stole from dozens of billionaires, but someone was paying a premium to keep a guy like you on the hunt for 3 years. Someone who didn't just lose money, but lost something that could ruin them." Andrew thought back to his father-in-law, Jason Whitman. Whitman's logistics empire was heavily audited, yet he always had massive, unexplained capital to crush his competitors. Andrew remembered the closed-door meetings, the encrypted phones, the sudden vicious mood swings Whitman had exhibited over the last few years. "Scott didn't just steal investment funds, did he?" Andrew asked, the pieces rapidly locking into place. "He was a laundry machine. He was washing illicit funds. That's why the FBI couldn't find him. The people he stole from didn't want the feds looking too closely at the books." Silas raised an eyebrow, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his stoic face. "You're sharp for a guy living in a dirt hole. Give me a name, Silas. I work for a shell corporation called Apex Holdings." Silas finally conceded, knowing his leverage was gone. "I don't know the ultimate beneficiary, just that they operate heavily out of the Pacific Northwest. Shipping, logistics, real estate." Andrew's blood ran cold, followed immediately by a surge of pure, unadulterated fire. Pacific Northwest, shipping and logistics, Apex Holdings, Jason Whitman. The $195 million sitting in the vault just 10 feet away didn't belong to a bunch of faceless investors. A massive chunk of it was Jason Whitman's dark money, the very wealth that allowed Whitman to act like a god. The wealth he used to ruin Andrew's life, buy off his daughter, and throw Andrew out into a blizzard to die. Fate hadn't just given Andrew a way to survive. It had handed him the sword to cut the Whitman empire to the ground. Andrew lowered the 1,911 slightly, his mind processing the staggering reality of his discovery. The bunker was silent, save for the crackle of the wood stove and Odin's heavy breathing. "You're tracking for Whitman," Andrew said softly, almost to himself. Silas frowned. "Who?" "Jason Whitman. That's your ultimate employer. And you just walked into a room with the man he tried to murder less than 24 hours ago." Silas processed this information quickly. His eyes darted to the slightly ajar bookshelf that concealed the vault. He could see the edges of the Pelican cases. "I don't care about family drama. Friend, I'm a contractor. I was hired to find the bunker, secure the assets, and call in an extraction team. If Whitman is your enemy, that's your business. But there are 8 watertight cases in that vault. You can't carry them. You don't have a vehicle. When this storm breaks in 4 hours, Whitman's sweepers will be in the air. You'll be dead, and the dog will be dead." Andrew knew Silas was right. The logistics of moving nearly $200 million in cash, gold, and bonds were impossible on foot. "Where is your transport?" Andrew demanded. "Quarter-mile down the ridge," Silas replied. "Customized Sherp ATV. Enclosed cab, low-pressure treads. It can drive over 4 feet of powder without sinking. It's got the payload capacity to move those cases to the Canadian border by sunrise." Andrew stared at the mercenary. Silas was a professional. He was motivated by profit, not loyalty. And right now, Andrew held all the cards. "Here is how this is going to work," Andrew said, his voice dropping into the commanding, absolute tone of a SEAL team leader. "You are going to take me to that Sherp. We are going to load all 8 cases. You are going to drive us precisely where I tell you to go." "And why would I do that?" Silas asked. "The moment I get you to civilization, I have a dozen ways to end you. Because if you don't agree, I put a .45 caliber hollow point through your left kneecap, tie you to that cast iron stove, and let you freeze to death when the fire goes out," Andrew stated factually. "But if you play ball, I will open one of those Pelican cases right now, and I will hand you $2 million in untraceable bearer bonds. You tell your bosses at Blackwood that the thermal hit was a bust. Some local hunter's cabin. The trail went cold." Silas stared at Andrew. He looked at the gun, then at Odin, and finally at the open vault. $2 million was a massive, clean payday, entirely off the books, with zero risk of a firefight with an obviously lethal ex-SEAL. "You've got yourself a driver," Silas grunted. "Good. Stand up. Keep your hands where I can see them." The next 2 hours were an agonizing test of physical endurance. The blizzard had begun to lose its violent edge, the howling winds subsiding into a steady, heavy snowfall. The temperature was still well below zero. Andrew forced Silas to haul the heavy Pelican cases out of the hidden vault. Each case weighed nearly 80 pounds. Andrew carried one in his left hand, keeping his right hand free with the 1,911 pressed against Silas's spine. Odin flanked them, constantly patrolling the perimeter. As they trudged through the deep snow, the physical toll on Andrew was immense. His bad legs screamed in agony with every step, the cold seeping into the metal pins holding his femur together. But the burning desire for retribution fueled him. Every agonizing step through the snow was a step closer to dismantling Jason Whitman. They reached the Sherp ATV parked beneath a canopy of dense, snow-laden pines. It was a mechanical beast, a squat, rugged vehicle sitting on massive paddle-like tires, designed to conquer the harshest terrains on Earth. Silas unlocked the rear hatch, and they loaded the 8 Pelican cases into the cargo hold. The suspension barely groaned under the weight of the fortune. Andrew pulled Silas back before he could enter the cab. He ordered the mercenary to open the 3rd case. Inside were stacks of high-denomination bearer bonds. Andrew counted out a stack roughly equating to $2 million and shoved it into Silas's chest rig. "Payment up front," Andrew said. "Now, get in the driver's seat. No sudden movements. Odin sits in the passenger seat. If you reach for a weapon, if you try to key a radio, he will tear your throat out before I even have to pull the trigger. Understood?" Silas looked at the massive German shepherd, who leaped effortlessly into the cab and settled onto the passenger seat. His eyes locked onto Silas. "Crystal clear," Silas muttered, climbing behind the wheel. Andrew climbed into the back, wedging himself among the cases of millions. He slammed the rear hatch shut, sealing them inside the heated cab. Silas engaged the ignition. The heavy diesel engine roared to life, a beautiful, rumbling sound of salvation. The Sherp lurched forward, its massive tires easily churning through the deep snowbanks, leaving the frozen hobbit hole and the ghost of Thomas Scott behind. Andrew sat in the dim light of the cargo bay, his hand resting on one of the Pelican cases. He looked out the frosted rear window as the mountain landscape faded into the darkness. 24 hours ago, he was a beggar in his own home. He was a broken toy, discarded by a billionaire and his cold-blooded daughter. They had intended for him to become a frozen corpse, a forgotten statistic in an Idaho winter. Instead, they had created a ghost. A ghost armed with military training, an apex predator at his side, and a war chest of $195 million of their own money. Andrew pulled his phone from Silas's confiscated gear bag and powered it on. He didn't have service yet, but as soon as they hit the lowlands, he had a call to make. He knew exactly who to contact in the underground financial world to wash the bonds and secure the cash. Jason Whitman thought he controlled the world from his glass fortress. But Andrew was about to bring the fortress crashing down. He wasn't just going to survive. He was going to take everything. The Sherp ATV was a masterpiece of Russian engineering, a brutalist box of metal and thick rubber that treated the 4-foot snowdrifts like mere suggestions. Inside the heated cab, the rhythmic, heavy thrum of the diesel engine was the only sound for hours. Andrew sat in the dim cargo hold, his legs stretched out beside the 8 Pelican cases containing his newfound empire. In the passenger seat, Odin remained locked in a state of high-alert vigilance. The German shepherd's amber eyes never left Silas. Every time the mercenary shifted his grip on the steering wheel or adjusted the heavy winter coat around his shoulders, Odin would let out a low, structural rumble that vibrated through the cab. "Your dog has a staring problem," Silas muttered, keeping his eyes on the GPS monitor illuminating the dashboard. "He doesn't like mercenaries," Andrew replied coldly. "Where are we?" 20 miles outside of Sandpoint. We'll hit plowed blacktop in about 40 minutes. My extraction point was supposed to be a private airstrip near the Canadian border. A Blackwood Consulting Gulfstream is waiting on the tarmac. "We aren't going to Canada," Andrew said, shifting his weight to ease the burning ache in his shattered femur. "We're going to Spokane. Take the back roads. If you merge onto Interstate 90, Odin gets a new chew toy." Silas sighed, tapping the screen to alter the route. "Spokane it is. But you need to understand something. Pendleton. Jason Whitman isn't just a rich guy with a temper. He practically owns the local infrastructure. The moment I miss my check-in window, Blackwood will flag my transponder as compromised. Whitman will have eyes on every toll booth, highway camera, and private airfield in the Pacific Northwest by dawn. Let him look," Andrew said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the satellite phone he had confiscated from Silas. The digital bars flickered as they finally descended below the storm-battered peaks. He dialed a 13-digit international number from memory. It rang 4 times before a voice answered, thick with sleep and irritation. "This number is supposed to be dead." "Nothing is ever really dead, Dom," Andrew said. On the other end of the line, located in a high-rise apartment in Vancouver, Dominic Riley sat up in bed. Dom was a former naval intelligence cyber warfare specialist. He and Andrew had worked joint operations in Syria, where Dom had been tasked with dismantling terrorist financial networks. Dom had been forced out of the Navy after a gray hat hacking scandal, but his loyalty to Andrew was forged in blood. "Andrew? Christ, man. I heard about what happened with the Whitman family. Word on the wire is that your father-in-law threw you out into the deep freeze. I was about to call in a favor to get local SAR teams to look for a body. The body is breathing, Dom. And I need a favor. A big one. Namit. I need a clean drop location in Spokane. Industrial, off the grid, heavy bay doors. And I need you to cross the border and meet me there in 3 hours. Bring your heavy rigs. The offline servers." Dom hesitated. "Andrew, what did you do?" "I didn't do anything. But I found something. Thomas Scott's ghost." There was a dead silence on the line. Every person who dealt in high-stakes finance or cybersecurity knew the legend of Thomas Scott and the missing $195 million. "You're holding the Scott stash?" Dom's voice dropped to an awed whisper. 8 cases. Cash, gold, and bearer bonds. But more importantly, I have Scott's physical ledgers. He wasn't just stealing, Dom. He was washing dark money for Apex Holdings, Jason Whitman's shell company. A dark, sharp laugh echoed through the receiver. "Oh, Andrew, you didn't just find a gold mine. You found the detonator to Whitman's entire life. I'm leaving right now. I'll text you the coordinates to an abandoned textile warehouse in East Spokane. It belongs to a shell company I control. See you in 3 hours." Andrew killed the connection. He looked up to find Silas staring at him through the rearview mirror. "You're not just running, are you?" Silas asked, a mix of apprehension and respect in his voice. "You're going to fight him. Whitman took my life, stripped me of my dignity, and left my dog to freeze. Taking his money isn't enough," Andrew said, resting his hand on the cold polymer of a Pelican case. "I'm going to erase him." Meanwhile, 60 miles away at the Whitman Mountain Estate, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The blizzard had broken, leaving the compound buried under pristine, glittering white snow. In the mahogany-lined study, Jason Whitman was pacing in front of the fireplace, a heavy crystal glass of scotch clutched in his fist. Sarah Whitman sat on the leather sofa, casually flipping through a bridal magazine, utterly detached from the gravity of the situation. Gregory Cole, her new fiancé and Whitman's VP, was on his phone, his face pale. "Nothing," Gregory said, hanging up the phone. "Blackwood Consulting lost the transponder signal on Silas Croft's ATV 2 hours ago. The thermal drone feed went dead. They sent a chopper over the coordinates of the bunker, but the storm covered the tracks. Croft is gone." Whitman hurled his glass into the fireplace. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, the scotch causing the flames to flare violently. "He didn't just disappear, Gregory. He found the bunker. He found my money," Whitman roared, his face purple with rage. "That mercenary bastard found the 195 million, killed his comms, and ran." "Daddy, please stop yelling," Sarah said, annoyed. "It's just money. The insurance will cover the corporate losses." Whitman turned on his daughter, his eyes wide with a manic terror she had never seen before. "Insurance? Sarah, you ignorant child. That wasn't corporate capital. That was untaxed, off-the-books liquidity. That money is the only thing keeping the feds from auditing the Cayman accounts. If Croft takes that ledger to the FBI, we are all going to federal prison for the rest of our lives." Gregory swallowed hard. "Sir, what about Andrew? We left him out there." "Andrew is dead," Whitman barked. "No one survives a negative 30-degree whiteout in a canvas jacket. The dogs will find his frozen corpse in the spring. Right now, I want every private gun we have hunting Silas Croft." Whitman had no idea that the ghost of Andrew Pendleton was already moving into position, and the war had already begun. The East Spokane textile warehouse was a cavernous, forgotten relic of the city's industrial past. The Sherp ATV rolled through the heavy steel bay doors just as the sun began to cast a pale gray light over the snow-covered city. Andrew stepped out onto the cracked concrete floor, his bad leg protesting fiercely. Odin bounded out behind him, instantly dropping his nose to the ground and sweeping the perimeter of the massive room, checking for explosives or hidden threats, a habit permanently ingrained from their tours in Fallujah. 10 minutes later, a sleek, unmarked black SUV pulled into the warehouse. Dominic Riley stepped out, carrying 2 heavy, reinforced Pelican server cases of his own. Dom was a wiry man in his late 30s, wearing a faded hoodie and wire-rimmed glasses. He took one look at Andrew, then at the 8 massive cases stacked by the ATV, and let out a long whistle. "You look like hell, man," Dom said, shaking Andrew's hand. "I've had better Christmases," Andrew replied. He gestured to Silas, who was leaning against the Sherp, smoking a cigarette. "This is Silas. He's the Blackwood contractor Whitman hired to find the stash. He's on our payroll now." Dom raised an eyebrow. "You trust him?" "I trust that he likes money and hates his bosses," Andrew said. "He knows the operational protocols Blackwood is using to hunt us. He's our radar." Silas flicked his cigarette onto the concrete. $2 million buys a lot of radar, gentlemen. I'll watch the door." Dom set up his mobile command center on an old rusted shipping crate. Within minutes, he had 3 encrypted laptops running off a localized cellular satellite uplink. Andrew handed him Thomas Scott's final ledger. Dom flipped through the handwritten pages, his eyes darting across the columns of account numbers, routing codes, and passwords. "This is incredible." Scott was old school. He wrote down the encrypted passkeys to Whitman's offshore shadow accounts. Cayman Islands, Cyprus, Switzerland. "It's a spiderweb of illicit corporate wealth. How much of it can we hit?" Andrew asked. Dom began typing furiously, his fingers a blur across the mechanical keyboards. "Whitman is currently routing $50 million through a holding company in Cyprus to finalize his merger with Gregory Cole's logistics firm. The merger goes public on Monday. If that money isn't there, the merger collapses, the SEC flags the discrepancy, and Whitman's stock plummets." Andrew finished. "Drain it." "Andrew, if I use Scott's keys to access the Cyprus account, I can't just transfer $50 million to a local bank. The alarm bells will deafen the global financial sector. It has to go somewhere dark. Put it in a decentralized crypto tumbler. Scatter it across 10,000 anonymous wallets," Andrew commanded. "I don't care about keeping that $50 million. I just care that Whitman loses it." "Initiating the bleed," Dom said, a wicked grin spreading across his face. He hit the enter key, hundreds of miles away, in the towering glass skyscraper of Whitman Logistics in downtown Seattle. Jason Whitman was sitting in his executive boardroom. He had flown in by private helicopter that morning. Desperate to manage the crisis of the missing mercenary, Gregory Cole sat beside him, nervously reviewing the merger documents. Suddenly, the sleek, minimalist phone on Whitman's conference table buzzed. It was a direct, encrypted line to his private wealth manager in Geneva. Whitman snatched it up. "What is it, Mr. Whitman?" The frantic, heavily accented voice echoed through the earpiece. "Sir, we have a catastrophic breach. The Cypress holding account. It is emptying." Whitman stood up so fast his heavy leather chair crashed to the floor. "What do you mean emptying? Halt the transactions." "I cannot, sir. The transfer protocols are using the master keys, the ones Thomas Scott created 8 years ago. The system thinks it's an authorized internal liquidation. The $50 million for the Cole merger. It is gone. Vanished into a blockchain tumbler. Sir, your liquidity is zero." The phone slipped from Whitman's hand, clattering against the polished mahogany table. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. Gregory stood up, panicked. The dot. "Jason? Jason, what is it?" Before Whitman could answer, his executive assistant tentatively knocked and opened the boardroom doors. "Mr. Whitman, I apologize for the interruption, but a private courier just dropped off a package for you." It was marked urgent, cleared by security. She placed a small, plain wooden box on the table and quickly retreated. Whitman, his hands trembling uncontrollably, reached out and popped the brass latch on the box. He lifted the lid. Inside sat a heavy, rusted iron deadbolt assembly, shattered into pieces by brute force. Resting on top of the broken lock was a Polaroid photograph. It was a picture of a massive, jet-black German shepherd, sitting regally atop a mountain of $100 bills. Wrapped around the dog's collar was the thin canvas jacket Andrew had been wearing when he was thrown out into the blizzard. On the back of the photograph, written in black marker, was a single sentence. "The cold didn't kill me, Jason, but it's going to kill you." Whitman stared at the photograph, his mind fracturing under the weight of the impossible reality. The ghost wasn't Silas Croft. The ghost was the man he had murdered. Andrew Pendleton was alive. He had the $195 million war chest, and he was coming for the throne. The absolute destruction of a billionaire's empire does not happen quietly. It is a violent, chaotic implosion. Inside the glass fortress of Whitman Logistics, Jason Whitman was unraveling. The loss of the $50 million was a fatal wound, but the photograph of the German shepherd sitting on the Scott cash was the kill shot. It meant Andrew had the ledgers. If those ledgers saw the light of day, Whitman wouldn't just lose his company. He would spend the rest of his natural life in a federal supermax prison for international money laundering. "Get Blackwood Consulting on the line," Whitman hissed to Gregory, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and homicidal rage. "I don't care what it costs. Offer them a $10 million bounty. Off the books. I want Andrew Pendleton dead. And I want those ledgers burned." Gregory, his own future evaporating before his eyes, frantically dialed the encrypted number. How are they going to find him? "Jason, the man is a ghost. He just siphoned $50 million into a crypto tumbler," Whitman snarled, pacing like a caged animal. He had to use a terminal to do it. "Have Blackwood track the IP bounce. He's in Spokane. I can feel it. Send the sweepers." Back in the cavernous, freezing textile warehouse in East Spokane, the digital war was already won. But Andrew knew the physical war was coming to their doorstep. Silas Croft's confiscated satellite radio suddenly chirped, a harsh mechanical sound cutting through the silence of the warehouse. Silas walked over, picked it up, and read the scrolling text on the tiny LCD screen. He let out a low whistle, looking up at Andrew. "Well, you just hit the big leagues, Pendleton," Silas said, tossing the radio to Andrew. "Blackwood just pushed a localized burn order to every contractor in a 200-mile radius. $10 million for your head in the physical ledgers. They traced Dom's proxy server bounce to the local cell tower grids in this industrial park. They are closing in. Dom stopped typing, his face pale behind his wire-rimmed glasses. Andrew, I bounced that signal through 6 different countries. They shouldn't have been able to trace it that fast. They didn't trace the hack, Dom. They traced the massive spike in bandwidth from this specific sector when you initiated the transfer, Andrew said, tossing the radio onto the concrete. He looked at Silas. 10 million is a lot of money, Silas. Are you reconsidering your loyalties? Silas chuckled, drawing his Glock 19 and checking the chamber. 10 million is a promise from a desperate man who just lost all his liquidity. The 2 million you gave me is sitting in my duffel bag in crisp bearer bonds. I prefer cash in hand. Plus, I don't like my odds against you and the dog. Andrew nodded. The SEAL mindset took over, cold and calculating. Dom, pack up the servers. Secure the ledgers in the Pelican cases and load everything back into the Sherp. You're driving. What about you? Dom asked, frantically unhooking cables. Whitman sent an extermination squad. If we run now, they'll track the Sherp. We have to break their teeth here. We funnel them in, neutralize the threat, and disappear. Andrew walked to the center of the warehouse, his eyes scanning the rusted catwalks, the heavy steel support beams, and the deep shadows pooling in the corners of the massive building. It was the perfect kill box. He began to systematically shoot out the overhead halogen lights, with his 1,911, plunging the warehouse into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the pale moonlight filtering through the high, grime windows. Odin, Andrew commanded softly. The massive German shepherd trotted to his side, his ears pinned back, his amber eyes adjusting to the gloom. Andrew knelt, scratching the dog behind the ears. Hunt, brother. Silent. Odin vanished into the shadows like a wisp of black smoke. 20 minutes later, the heavy steel side door of the warehouse groaned in protest. The Blackwood strike team didn't bother knocking. A localized breaching charge blew the door off its hinges with a deafening crack, sending a shockwave of dust and concrete shrapnel across the floor. 4 men stepped through the smoke. They were outfitted in full tactical gear, moving with the synchronized lethal grace of Tier 1 operators. They wore quad-tube night vision goggles, their suppressed submachine guns sweeping the dark, empty expanse of the warehouse. Spread out. Check the thermal signatures, the point man whispered into his throat mic. From his perch on the rusted iron catwalk 20 feet above, Andrew watched them move. He had coated himself, Silas, and Odin in the fine freezing dust of the textile plant, severely dampening their thermal output against the freezing concrete. The point man moved down the left flank, passing a stack of rotting wooden pallets. He never saw the shadow detach itself from the wall. Odin struck without a sound. The 85-pound dog launched himself through the air, his jaws clamping shut over the man's tactical rifle, dragging the barrel down. The sheer momentum drove the mercenary hard into the concrete. Before the man could scream, Odin's paws were on his chest, pinning him. The heavy thud alerted the second operator. He spun, raising his weapon toward the shadow. Crack. Crack. 2 rounds from Andrew's 1,911 echoed from the catwalk, striking the operator dead center in his ceramic chest plate. The kinetic impact didn't penetrate, but it hit with the force of a sledgehammer, knocking the breath from the man's lungs and sending him sprawling backward. Silas opened fire from behind a rusted forklift on the ground floor, laying down a suppressing hail of bullets that forced the remaining 2 operators to dive for cover behind a concrete pillar. Contact right! Catwalk! One of the mercenaries yelled, firing a blind burst upward. Sparks showered down as the bullets chewed into the rusted iron. Andrew was already moving. He slid down a steel support cable, ignoring the blinding pain in his leg, and landed silently behind the concrete pillar where the 2 men were taking cover. He drew a heavy steel wrench he had found on the workbench and swung it with devastating force. It caught the closest operator in the back of the knee. The man's leg buckled with a sickening snap, and he went down screaming. The final operator spun around, bringing his rifle to bear on Andrew. But he was a fraction of a second too late. A massive black blur slammed into his side. Odin had crossed the floor in seconds, hitting the man with enough force to shatter his ribs. The operator dropped his weapon, gasping in agony as the dog stood over him, teeth bared an inch from his throat, a deep, terrifying growl vibrating through the dusty air. Silence descended on the warehouse, broken only by the groans of the incapacitated mercenaries. The ambush had lasted less than 45 seconds. Andrew stepped into the pale moonlight, looking down at the strike team leader pinned beneath Odin. He reached down and ripped the comms unit from the man's tactical vest. Andrew keyed the mic, knowing it was patched directly to Blackwood Command and likely being monitored by Jason Whitman himself. "Whitman," Andrew said, his voice echoing coldly into the radio. "Your sweepers are neutralized, the money is gone, and the ledgers are already in the mail. Checkmate." He crushed the radio beneath his boot. The following morning, the sun broke over Seattle, casting a brilliant, golden light on the glass facade of Whitman Logistics. But inside the penthouse executive suite, the world had gone entirely dark. At precisely 8 a.m., the digital timers Dom had set in the encrypted servers triggered. The contents of Thomas Scott's physical ledgers meticulously photographed, decoded, and cross-referenced with Whitman's hidden offshore accounts were simultaneously emailed to the director of the FBI, the chairman of the SEC, the cybercrimes division of the IRS, and the news desks of every major media outlet in the country. The data drop didn't just expose Whitman's embezzlement and tax evasion, it linked Apex Holdings to the laundering of funds for illegal arms syndicates operating out of Eastern Europe. It was a financial nuke. At 8:15 a.m., a fleet of black SUVs surrounded the Whitman estate in Idaho, and another fleet barricaded the Seattle headquarters. Jason Whitman was sitting in his leather chair, staring blankly out the floor-to-ceiling windows, when the heavy oak doors of his office were kicked open. A dozen FBI agents swarmed the room, weapons drawn. "Jason Whitman, you are under arrest for federal money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy," the lead agent barked, slamming the billionaire against his own mahogany desk to apply the handcuffs. Whitman didn't fight. He didn't yell. The arrogant, untouchable tycoon was completely broken as they marched him through the lobby of his own building, past the flashing cameras of the local press. He looked like an empty shell. He knew his empire was ashes. Across the city, Sarah Whitman's morning at her luxury spa was rudely interrupted. Her platinum credit cards declined. Her bank accounts were frozen. When she called Gregory Cole for help, the line was dead. Gregory had seen the news break and was already halfway to the Canadian border, abandoning her to face the wreckage of her father's legacy alone. She had traded a loyal man for a fortune, and in the end, she was left with absolutely nothing. 3,000 miles away, the air was warm, smelling of salt and tropical flowers. A sleek private Gulfstream jet sat on the tarmac of a small, discreet airstrip in the Caribbean. Andrew Pendleton walked down the stairs, the tropical sun warming his skin, a stark, beautiful contrast to the lethal Idaho blizzard that had almost claimed his life just a week prior. His legs still ached, but he moved with a renewed sense of purpose and freedom. Beside him trotted Odin, the massive German shepherd looking utterly majestic as he sniffed the warm ocean breeze, seemingly approving of their new environment. Dom and Silas were waiting by a pair of black luxury SUVs. They had successfully fenced the bearer bonds and the gold bullion through Dom's underground networks, washing the staggering $195 million until it was completely untraceable. They had divided the spoils. Silas had received his promised cut and an extra bonus for his work in the warehouse, entirely content to retire to a private island and leave the mercenary life behind. Dom had taken his share to fund a massive, decentralized tech startup in South America. "Flight plan is wiped, Andrew," Dom said, leaning against the SUV. "The shell corporations are sealed. You officially do not exist on paper." "Good." Andrew smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression he hadn't worn in years. "What are you going to do now?" Silas asked, adjusting his sunglasses. "You have enough money to buy a small country." Andrew looked down at Odin. The dog looked up, panting happily, waiting for the next command. They had survived war zones. They had survived betrayal. And they had survived the freezing grip of death. "We're going to find a quiet piece of land with a lot of trees," Andrew said, resting his hand on Odin's head. "And we are going to enjoy the heat." The ghost of Andrew Pendleton had vanished, leaving behind the shattered ruins of those who had wronged him, and taking with him the ultimate prize of survival. What an absolutely epic ride. From being thrown into a deadly whiteout by his own flesh and blood, to unearthing a frozen $195 million bunker, Andrew and Odin proved that loyalty, elite training, and raw willpower can overcome the darkest betrayals. They didn't just survive the elements, they masterminded the ultimate takedown of a corrupt billionaire empire, securing their freedom and the ultimate revenge. If Andrew and Odin's incredible journey of survival and karma had your heart pounding, smash that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a story where the good guys get the ultimate payback, and hit subscribe with the bell on so you never miss our deep dives into the most thrilling survival stories ever told. Now, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Would you have kept the money or turned it in?